You are listening to Rootbound, a podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside.
This spicy episode of Rootbound is brought to you by Red Hot Chili Peppers. They were the fruit of the capsicum genus long before they were a band.
Hi everybody, thank you for listening to this episode of Rootbound. I'm the host of the show, and my name is Steve, and Rootbound is the podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside, and each week I invite a guest who joins me on the show to share with us all about a plant that means something to them, and then I share with a guest about a plant that means something to me, and through this process we can all learn more about plants and learn more about each other. It is the philosophy of Rootbound that everybody has at least one plant that is meaningful to them, because plants are so integral to our lives as humans on this planet. We've been doing the show for over 2 years now, and it's pretty cool now that I'm able to bring back repeat guests every now and then, and it's been over a year since I've talked to this guest we're going to have today, and that guest is Mallory O'Donnell, and actually, Mallory was one of the first people I kind of just cold reached out to at the beginning of the show and said, hey, do you want to come talk on this little plant podcast about plants? And he was so gracious of joining me and talking about milkweed, which I learned so much about that plant. And I also learned a lot from Mallory about the philosophy of foraging in general, and he's a really great guest and a really great person to know regarding plants. So it's really cool to be able to have him back on the show now. We're going to learn from him about some more foraging facts. So welcome back, Mallory. Hey, Mallory, thank you for joining me on this episode of Rootbound.
Hi, Steve. How's it going? I'm very happy to be back.
Yeah, it's really great to have you back, and I'm really excited to talk to you about a plant. And which plant did you choose to tell us about today?
So I chose, daylily, but we'll find out that's a lot of things.
Okay.
Primarily I'll be talking about Hemerocallis fulva, which is usually it's called the tawny daylily or the orange daylily, or less flatteringly, the ditch lily.
Okay, okay? I have some daylilies that pop up in my yard every year. Is that the kind of most common one when we think of daylilies and we see them like in the summer? Is that the one we're talking about?
Yeah, especially it's the one in our rough neck of the woods, eastern U.S. and central U.S. that you see in large colonies along roadsides as well as in the garden. Mm-hmm. There are a huge variety of daylily cultivars and hybrids, and there's also different species that people grow. They're probably one of the most popular perennial plants in gardens across the world. They've kind of taken mm-hmm. over. And what we have as the wild form is it's largely sort of clonal organizations of an original orange daylily, which may or may not have been the cultivar called Europa, which has flown the coop and likes to grow in large masses, especially in drainage areas and along the side of the road. It likes slopes and it likes light shade, so it'll kind of be happy and it'll be happy in pretty shoddy ground. So it doesn't really need a huge amount of nutrients from the soil. It's pretty adaptable to poorer soils, to rockier conditions, sandier conditions. It's a real non-particular plant in terms of where it will grow.
Interesting. There's a number of things I think you said there that I want to get back to, but first, before we get too much, I want to know why you chose this plant and why is it meaningful to you.
Yeah, it's kind of a classic foraging plant. It shows up especially in older
Huh.
books. It's talked about a lot, but it's kind of fallen out of favor in recent years. It's not, if you get a newer book on foraging or a wild food cookbook, they might be mentioned. They may be used a little
It's
bit, but
wait,
they're not.
it's edible?
They're not. Yeah, it's like eminently edible. It's got, four edible parts, basically. So,
Wow. Okay.
yeah,
That's
and
so
it's
interesting.
perennial. So
I mean,
yeah, it's not
ah,
something that um, can be, collecting it doesn't really damage the original organism, which is either a boon or a curse, depending on whether you're removing invasive daylilies or you're just eating things from your garden. I think part of the reason why it hasn't been used as much lately and isn't talked about it as much is that it's a little bit complicated in terms of what just saying daylilies are edible isn't really clear enough. There are so many
mm,
hybrids now and so many different um, deviations from the original genetic material that it's not exactly 100% sure what is and isn't edible, except that there are a number of documented species that are eaten in East Asia. And it was originally grown for food and medicine before it became a popular ornamental plant. So we can kind of trace back the safer species to that point of origin, and then also the tradition of eating the feral, Europa clones that grow all pretty much everywhere in our part of the world. That's a pretty strong tradition as
okay.
well.
Well, that
Yeah, go ahead. I'm
okay. Well,
sorry.
that solves that solves the question when you told me you wanted to talk about daily. I was like, oh, Mallory's known for like being the forager guy, and I had no clue that it was edible. So
Yeah.
I was wondering if there was something else. But that's super fascinating.
Yeah, it's very edible. The buds of the flowers are probably the most enjoyed part and most celebrated. If you have traditional hot and sour soup, it often has the dried daylily flowers in it. They're sometimes called ginseng or golden needles in Chinese cuisine.
Mm.
Yeah, they're very interesting dried, and drying deals with the other issue, which we can come to at some point, which is that some people do have issues processing daylily raw. It can cause stomach upset. It's not
Mm.
really toxic, but it can cause gastrointestinal issues. From what I've seen, most of that is due
Mm.
to eating huge amounts of the raw daylily. So cooked, it seems to be
Hmm.
fine for most people. I also think it's possible there are some people that are just intolerant or have a food allergy because, like all these wild foods, the food allergies aren't documented because, people aren't eating them under the same circumstances and no one's trying to sell
Right.
them or market them. So they're not researched in the same way as like other common food allergens are. But I think it's primarily
Yeah.
poor preparation, and it could also be, again, back to the species thing, a case of using maybe a hybrid whose origins are uncertain. But um, there are also a few species that are edible. Like the one that's most prized, and the several that are cooked most widely in China are none of them is the one that we eat, Hemerocallis volva, but they are grown here. So, like Hemerocallis citrina, which is the really tall, kind of lemony yellow daylily, which is really beautiful. And that actually does really well up here. I've been seeing it a lot since I moved. But the most common one seems to be offshoots of those original plantings and those original species, but they will spread, and who knows. So my general advice, as far as people listening that might try to eat a daylily, is don't eat the ones from your garden unless you know exactly what species they are. The wild ones would be where you would start to experiment, and then they would have to be clearly the tawny, which is the orange Hemerocallis volva, which is it's not as hard to identify as you might think. It's the one that's kind of widely distributed. A lot of the cultivars are just generally going to be maybe in someone's landscaping or close to it.
Very interesting. Okay, well, I want to get into like how to eat it a little bit more. You mentioned the buds and things like that, but the one thing you mentioned when you were first talking about it that caught my interest was um, that it's a clonal and like all the daylilies out there. Like how is it reproducing um, i in that way to like spread so widely?
So it's primarily spreading by the the tuberous roots. If you have a if you grow daylilies in your garden, you'll often get advice to thin the plants in fall, preferably fall. But some people can do it in the spring. It just depends. And what you usually do is actually a lot of people will advocate doing what I do, which is you dig the whole plant up and then you separate out the roots. I do that partially so that I can eat them. So I'll take the bigger, fuller, fatter, juicier ones, and I'll replant the more damaged or slightly withered ones. And usually I'll have just another flush of the greens and the flowers in the spring and summer. But the tubers themselves are one of the edible parts. They're kind of like a
cool
potato-y thing. You can't peel them; they're too small. So obviously, I don't really advocate eating the wild tubers, especially considering where daylily tends to grow. But when you can grow the edible varieties, which there's many species that are well documented as edible, you can kind of pick and choose, and you can, when you're replanting, you can use the tubers. So that's more of like a eat the landscaping kind of thing than a wild food kind of thing. But it's definitely...
And that's because you'd be worried about the contamination from the kinds of ditches they tend to grow in?
Yeah, questionable soil pretty much is it, and questionable surface, spraying, or, a lot of the places I might collect the buds from or the greens from, I would be more questionable. They could be near, runoff or other areas where it's really going to concentrate in the tuber. Whereas these softer parts that you're cooking anyway, I wouldn't be as concerned about that. Obviously, I wouldn't collect them at all from something. I wouldn't go to a super fun site and pick daylilies. I don't advocate.
Probably most plants you probably want to avoid, I think.
Yeah,
a super fun site.
I think collecting garbage is the best thing you can do at a site like that.
Yeah.
But
this is so interesting. I mean, so we'll talk about the plant that I chose in a minute, but I knew there was some similarities, but there's even more than I thought.
That's cool.
Because I chose the plant that I chose also to hear what you have to say about it. So anyway, foreshadowing enough. Let's talk about let's talk about. I know you talked about the buds, you talked about the roots. Let's just kind of maybe start again and go through all the different edible parts of this plant and kind of how you eat them.
Okay, so the most, I would say, and the safest and most popular part would be the unopened flower buds. So when you see a daylily, which they don't really just bloom for a day, and that's kind of the common conception about them. But some of them bloom for 3 days, some of them 2, some of them 1, some of them will open very briefly and then wither if the conditions are right. But generally speaking, they pop the little sort of yellow-green nuggets of buds up, and then they open those, and then they close. And when they close, they are noticeably sort of withered or dried a bit. And it'll bloom for many weeks throughout the summer. That's kind of part of why they're so popular. They put off successions of blooms unless they're eaten by the deer, which is extremely common. They're like deer candy. They'll eat the new shoots and they'll eat the buds. So that bud is the sort of the main one. They're sometimes sold dried before they open, and sometimes they're sold after they open. And that's the golden needles. They are, when they're unopened, they're very crisp, and they have like a spicy green bean kind of flavor, a little sweet too. They're actually more nutritious than green beans, which is interesting. They have more protein, and the trace vitamins and things that are in green beans, they're all present in daylily buds to larger amounts. They're pretty quick cooking for me, but I don't have any stomach issues with daylily. I can eat daylily raw. It doesn't bother me. Some people, I always advise well cooking them at first, but that's kind of true of any wild food. Those are probably
totally.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I would say when you brought that up earlier about cooking, I feel like correct me if I'm wrong. This is my opinion, but see what you think about it. I feel like we're kind of like spoiled by eating vegetables and plants raw because we've cultivated plants for so long, but like wild plants are kind of different, and they haven't been selectively bred to be like nice to our tummies. And so like cooking is, I think, a pretty good
Yeah.
idea for a lot of those
Yeah,
things.
and a lot of them we're not used to. I mean, it's one thing to eat a variety of wild mustards. Your stomach's not going to be confused by that. It's going to be the same compounds that are
Sure.
in, kale or whatever. But something like a daylily is going to be a little unusual. So I think with anything like that, I mean, I wouldn't go eat a new kind of food that was a celebrated world cuisine without, I wouldn't go on a 3-day bender of eating everything from it without, giving my body some time to go, hey, wait a minute. But
Yeah.
then that's true, especially of new ingredients, especially now that our science is so much more advanced in terms of food allergies. We're much more aware of the fact that there's a lot of things out there, and there's, I'm sure, a lot more to discover. And I think we'll find some of these reactions that people have to different unfamiliar ingredients or to wild foods are there's an allergic component that might be playing a role. So we were talking about the parts, right?
Yeah. Correct.
As
Sorry.
usual,
Tangent.
I went off on a little dance.
I love those.
So those are the most reliable. That's where I always recommend people start. The other thing that so the flour itself also, when it's open, you can eat. And that I find most people can eat raw. I haven't really encountered too many people who, I mean, you wouldn't really want to eat huge handfuls of the flours raw, but they're nice in salads and things like that. So the unopened flour, when the flour has opened and is closed again and is kind of withered or soft, it's very easy to tell just by feeling it. They don't feel like a vegetable anymore. Those can be dried, and that's the golden needles. Usually they'll be sold in a dried form, and you usually add them to a soup. You can reconstitute them in water and then cook them. Those I always find are better.
Do they like?
Go ahead.
I'm thinking of the plant itself. Did like the petals kind of like break apart into like thin strands? Like I'm thinking, why is it called golden needles?
I think it's because of how it looks while it's dried. Actually, I think there's actually a more concrete reason for this, and of course, it's one of the things I didn't bone up on when I was getting ready. I think there may be a different reason for that. It may simply be how when the flour is folded, the purportedly the version that, or the species that is popular in China is the citrina, which is the golden. It's like that pale yellow, lemon yellow one. So I can kind of see how if you took the petals in your hands, they would be they're kind of long and pointy, and it's sort of a narrower, more delicate shape than and larger and longer shape than the regular orange daylilies. So perhaps it's that, but they do kind of have like a golden brown kind of look when they're dried too. They can be a little darker, but usually they have kind of a deep coloration. So now there's probably some other completely different reason for that, and I'm just spouting nonsense right now. But that is a thought.
That's okay. The audience can also Google it, and we're not afraid to tell the audience to Google it on the show.
That is they have us at that advantage. So the flowers are kind of they're like a fun, I could put them in spring rolls. They have kind of a mild, slightly bitter, slightly nutty flavor. They're not floral tasting, really. They have that kind of sharpness that a lot of flowers do. Where they're kind of, just a little slightly bitter in an unusual way. But they're great in, as just something you toss into dishes. The buds are much more complex in flavor and definitely more substantial. They're more like a vegetable. The other parts would be the tubers, which I mentioned, and those definitely should be cooked. Those should definitely be cooked. They're not. They're not really worth eating raw, and they're very good roasted. They're very nutty. They have people always say like they're like little mini fingerling potatoes. They're not really, but they kind of have a sweeter, nuttier flavor. But they're really good roasted, and you just eat them whole. Provided, of course.
How would you compare them to sunchokes?
They're definitely different from sunchokes. They're not that kind of watery, fibrous kind of and they definitely don't have tons of inulin in them, so they're not going to make you have intense gas attacks. or make some people have
Sure.
intense gas attacks. Now because of the daylily, they may cause, gastrointestinal issues, but that's for each person, I think, to figure out. And I think starting with like a
For sure.
flower or a bud is a much better way. Plus, it's much less time consuming and tedious. Um, a big part for me of the daylily though is the shoots. Um, they will become tough after they've been out of the ground and have reached a certain height and whatnot and age. But in the early spring, they're one of the first greens that comes out, in the garden or in your home. They'd be pretty early shoots. They're going to be, after the daffodils and things like that, and after the crocuses, but they'll start to emerge in the early spring or mid spring, depending on where you are. And they look kind of like, I always think of them as like a leek that was fanned out into the shape of kind of a trident, or like they sort of droop, kind of like if you've ever taken a leek and like you cut it down the middle and separate it like a fan. It looks kind of similar. They have a real like
Oh,
a
yeah.
white core. They're kind of ra- you know layered a bit like an onion is or a leek is. So but they're primarily going to be, they'll be white, like where the ground is covering them, or where where they're shaded a bit at the core of the top of the root tuber. And I usually collect them probably when they're a couple inches tall to maybe 5 inches tall, something in that neck of the woods. They have a real interesting flavor. It's definitely not strong like a strong green. It's very mild. They actually do have kind of a leaky flavor, like a very slight savory, oniony, mushroomy thing going on. What's really weird is
Hmm.
because I grow them, I would, especially where I just moved from, my mom was wild about daylilies, so we had tons of varieties. If you get real close to where the tuber is, like if you kind of dig around the base of it a little bit and you cut it like right off at where the tuber forms, the little bottom half an inch of it has a taste that's a little bit like white truffle oil, which sounds super
Oh,
weird, but I
whoa.
can't shake that association. I mean, I know white truffle oil is awful and no one should eat it, but it has that kind of a flavor, like a weirdly almost artificial, but like mushroomy. Like there's a mushroomy flavor to it, which is really unusual, and they go really
Wow.
well with mushrooms. The greens I like to use, I stir fry them with like tofu and wood ear mushrooms, or any kind of mushroom that might be in season in that time of the year. They're really fantastic, like that kind of a, yeah, just like a stir fry, a quick cook. My other favorite thing to do with the greens is to make daylily kimchi, which is a staple here. It's just daylilies and the salt and spices, aminos, whatever, ginger and
And
garlic,
and and that's with the shoots specifically.
and that's what.
It's with the shoot specifically that you do
Yeah,
the
that's
kimchi
with
with.
just the greens, the shoots. You could make it with the flower buds too. It's good with the flower buds, but I always do it with the. I make a big batch of it with the greens every year, and it's just I never make enough. It's really fantastic. But it has a very unique flavor. I mean, I've brought like last year at New Moon, Mycology Fest, I brought a bunch of wild food to sample for a wild food fermentation class, and I've brought it to other events I've done and shared it with other people. And I always get one person always has the same reaction, which is this doesn't taste like anything I've ever tasted before, which is, I think, pretty
Wow.
pretty high praise for a plant. I think that we're so inundated with different kinds of vegetables and greens that we've all eaten at this point. If we're cuisine curious, that's always kind of a cool thing. And it's like savory in a real interesting way. It doesn't have a lot of the sort of the qualities of greens that people don't like as much. Like it has a more interesting texture. Again, kind of like a leek, kind of like a real briefly cooked leek. That kind of it's like slightly chewy, but in a good way.
Wow.
But
Okay. So this is very inspiring because yeah, I have to double check on the identification but I'm pretty sure I have these daylilies in my yard. But okay,
yeah.
let me ask you a couple questions. They are orange,
Hmm.
but they are also in the same area where I'm pretty sure somebody planted daffodils and crocuses are kind of on the edge of this
Mhm.
driveway, so they look like they were planted. So what can I do to like know that that I should experiment with these?
You mean how to differentiate them from the other shoots?
Yeah,
Well, they're going to be later
yeah, or
than
to
those. Yeah, and
the
they're
other shoots, but no,
definitely.
how did
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
sorry, how do I make sure that they're like a daylily that I should try to eat and not some cultivar that somebody planted?
So
Um,
this is a
is it
good.
really just the color, or is there anything else I should look for?
That's a great question because it actually sort of ties back to a broader issue with foraging, which is something that I always recommend to people, especially if they're really not that plant savvy. Um, which is that, which is not to imply that you aren't plant savvy, but that
Well, I'm working on it.
you're the fact that you are so open about how you learn is one of the things that makes the show great. I mean, I really enjoy that.
Oh,
You're just
thank
very
you.
honest about it, and it's wonderful. And I mean, I think also those of us who do anything with plants know that none of us are ever going to even scratch the surface of what there is to know. It's just too much information. I mean, there are people
Absolutely.
that specialize in hemerocallis. That's like their entire lives. It's there's a lot to
Right.
learn about these things. So the 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 advice that I would give that ties back to that is that I don't really recommend eating anything that you haven't watched for a full turn of the calendar. So if you're
Uh-huh.
going to eat something, especially something that's new to you, of course, but um, you want to identify things not just based on the emerging greens, but on the flowers. Now, obviously, you know what this is. If you have a photo of it in flower, you can send it to me, and I can probably at least steer you in the right direction. The
Okay.
Yeah, their flower form is going to be how you really primarily ID these. Most of the greens look the same. I mean, I could kind of tell the difference between the hybrids and the fulva in my garden, but you know, I'm someone
Hmm.
who peers obsessively at tiny plants. It's not really helpful for most
Yeah.
people. But yeah, they're all going to be broadly similar. Yeah, and I definitely wouldn't recommend just combing through the local park or whatever, and picking the little ones that pop up. And of course, the real danger would be that someone would mistake them for iris shoots, which are quite different once you look at
Mm,
them, but they have the same kind of sort of white parts emerging, and then that they form a fan-like kind of almost like a real thick, flat blade of grass kind of leaf that they form, and they're not very similar to me, but they're definitely similar if you don't know um, what's what's happening, and there's definitely going to be irises that emerge at the same time as daylilies and slightly after. They came out around the
okay,
same
so
time in my garden. So
I think here's my plan based on what you said. I'm gonna look where they're coming up. I
hmm
think I know where they've come up the previous years, but I was never really paying attention to them because I didn't really think about them as edible.
yeah,
Which is funny. But I'm gonna try to see where they come up so I know what the shoots look like. But I'm not gonna eat any shoots this year. But when the flowers come up, I'll send you a picture,
yeah,
and I'll do
definitely.
my own kind of like identifying stuff that I do, and then we'll see
Yeah,
if
that's
these
great.
are the
Yeah, you
ones that
can
I want
always
to
send me
try
stuff like
those.
that too. I
Cool,
mean, I that's kind of what I do. So um,
awesome.
this is what I do. Is just people send me really pretty photos of mushrooms. That's like a real good axiomatic thing for plants in general, though, is to you want to watch like the whole cycle, because
Hmm.
something might look, green leaves can be very misleading. The big one for me, and even goes into smell, is the hemlock wild chervil thing. So hemlock and wild
Yeah,
chervil,
yeah.
they grow kind of together in Jersey where I was living, and they don't really look that they don't look the same, but they're certainly similar, and to the untrained eye, very similar. And in the cooler months, when you would be collecting wild chervil leaves, um, a lot of times hemlock won't have that distinctive smell that people recognize, and it'll smell when it
Mm,
doesn't have that. It smells exactly like wild chervil. So it's a
mm,
kind of an area where if you don't know the plant from first forming leaves to flower, or you can't, reasonably comprehend it either with a guide or by enough resources. I tend to wait until something shows me what it really is by flowering, by fruiting.
Would you like a sunbeam on a rainy day? You can catch a sunbeam when she smiles your way. Who's got all the leaves that flutter so they're ready to fall? Lily Bell. Birdies take one look at her and stop their singing to call. My, you're swell. Oh, and incidentally, there's one more thing to tell. If your eyes are open and you think you're seeing a dream, it's Lily Bell.
Very good. Well, thank you for sharing about Daylily with me. Do you mind if I share a plant with you?
Absolutely.
Awesome. So, I said there's some similarities here. So when you told me you're going to do daylily, I was thinking about where the daylily grows in my yard, and just a little bit over is another plant that I haven't really. I know this one is edible, but I haven't really experimented with it, and it's also similar even in the name, and that is the Asiatic Dayflower. I'm sure you know about that.
Yeah. Hmm.
So, just quickly for the audience, Dayflower, scientific name Camelina communis. It is this. It's kind of like a creeping groundy, creeps over the ground plant. If you have a better description for it, and then it has these little purple flowers, which are pretty interesting. That have 3 petals, but 2 of the petals are big and blue, and 1 petal is small and white, which is pretty. I think a unique thing about the way the flower looks.
That reminds me of one of my favorite handles from the early days of Instagram, which was someone's handle was Camelina Communist.
That's good. That's good. I was looking up. I
Just
always like to
dorky
look.
enough.
Yeah, I always like looking up the meaning behind those names, and this one is another one of the ones where Linnaeus just named it after some dudes he liked, and so
Yeah.
there was some Dutch guys who were the Cameline family, and they were famous botanists, and that whole genus is named
Yeah,
after them.
that's so the one that springs to mind for me with Dayflower is Tridescantia,
Mm.
um, which a lot of people know as um, the indoor plant. The
Oh,
very
okay.
colorful. Yeah, but there are native forms of Tridescantia, and they actually have a much more similar to daylily kind of leaf shape, which is like it's almost like a large grass plate. But they have a really similar flower if you look at them. There's a lot of really beautiful native varieties. To the eastern U.S. Um, that's in the same family. So that's then the flower. When you see the flower, you'll see
I
it's a
see.
very
So
very
in the
similar style.
Camelinaceae family, but
Yeah, which
genus
I
what did you
feel like
say?
that used to be somewhere else, kind of like
Uh-huh.
how daylily used to be a lily, and it's not anymore. Yeah, I feel
Ah,
like that was I feel like they were, they're similar in some ways. Camelina is similar in some ways to me visually and in terms of like the feel of the plant to a lot of um the Polygonaceae. So like the um smartweed,
oh yeah. Uh-huh.
knotweeds.
Like
Yeah,
the
those
way the
plants. It has
leaf
that
is
kind
around
of.
the way the leaf is around the stem with this kind of like sheathed
Hmm.
around, almost grass-like is similar like that,
Yep.
right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and the sort of the leaves can be kind of sharp sometimes. Camelina isn't usually. It's usually kind of watery. Feels kind of um, uh, squishy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Almost like a succulent kind of, but not quite on that level, but a little bit on that, like a little bit, maybe close to purslane, kind of. Not quite
Ah, yeah.
as, it's a little thinner than that, but yeah, that's a weird weed. It seems to be one of those ones that some people just have it in enormous profusion and can never get rid of it, but it's not something you see everywhere.
Yeah, I have a
As
big
far as a
chunk of
weed.
it in my yard, and I don't know if this is another one that was planted by somebody previously or it just popped up in this one area, but every year there's just a whole lot of it. But I've never experimented with eating it, even though I've heard that it's edible.
Yeah, it's not. what I would call fine dining. It's not a bad flavor, but it's definitely it's a good juicy green, kind of
Mm-hmm.
a poorer cousin to purslane again. You know, it's not anywhere near as good as purslane, which is probably one of my favorite greens,
Mm-hmm.
but you know, it's got that kind of watery, kind of crunchy flavor. It's not a bad flavor. It's a fairly mild green. It's actually a good green because it is a later spring, early summer in terms of the leaves. So it does
Ah,
have a nice availability window that doesn't really that it's kind of when the most of the wild greens sort of start to flower or peter out or become bitter. So it does have that, like kind of like lamb's quarters. It's like a summer green, which is you know
ah,
fairly handy.
cool. So you just use it like
But
in salads, or you cook it, or what's your favorite way to use it
yeah,
when you dip it?
I wouldn't cook it. I mean, so I would only probably pick it from my own garden.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of I would think it would fall apart cooked. I've
Mm-hmm.
never actually. I mean, who knows? Maybe it tastes quite good, but a lot of people cook purslane, which sort of is heretical to me. I mean, I know it is good. I've had it cooked; it's good, but I just can't imagine doing anything other than chopping it up with some onions and sumac and olive oil. Like it's just I can't. I
Mm.
can't wrap my head around doing anything else with purslane because I love it so much just to eat like
Yeah.
that. And but yeah, I would say it's a salad green probably. So definitely one that is a happy thing to eat when it occurs in your yard. But other than that, I wouldn't venture to eat it. Again, the basic kind of thing, raw greens from urban spots would be. This is going to be something that you'd find in parks and in landscaping.
Yeah.
It's not really a. I've never really seen it. I seen it maybe creep into the woods, but when it was like right next to someone's house, I haven't seen it, anywhere really in the wild so much, and not even really on like old farm fields or things like that. Although I'm sure I'm sure it's there somewhere. I think it's an agricultural weed originally, so
Interesting.
I'd have to read up on it. But
So the one thing
so
that
what is it that?
oh,
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 sorry.
go. What were you going to ask? Sorry, you go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, what was it? Is it the similarity that sort of drew you to talk about it, or just a curiosity?
So at first it was that it's close to the daylily. It's also it has the word day in it, which I thought that was gonna make a good episode title: Daylily and Dayflower.
There you go.
Um, but also, one of the fun facts and dazzling details I read about it is when we're talking about what you can eat or not. Apparently, it's actually really good at absorbing heavy metals from the soil, and there's been people experimenting with using it
Mm.
to restore areas that have been contaminated. But it's another reason why you'd want to be careful before eating it, which is one of the reasons when I think about when I first read about it years ago and that I've never eaten it because I've had this house for 5 years, but I don't really know what happened in the soil, and it's a residential area. Um, that made me a little nervous. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that as far as when you're thinking about a plant like that is good at absorbing stuff from the soil.
Yeah, I mean, I would do, if you haven't done like soil testing, I would definitely do that.
Yeah.
It's surprisingly easy.
Mm.
And I like up in this part of the country. I know UMass has a real good program, and you send them soil, but tons of places will do this. Local university science departments will do this, and there's a lot of agricultural concerns that will do this. It's not expensive, 15-20 dollars for us, and you'd probably want to do, maybe a few, depending on the
Few
size of your
areas.
plot.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
yeah, it's worth doing it. You can also do some, um, you can do soil analysis on your own, but in turn, if you have questions on a real deep level, like I have questions about certain elements of soil quality and certain trace minerals and things like that. But I mean, this was farmland and then a hay meadow for 20 years, and my partner has owned this property for over 20 years, so I have a pretty good idea of what's going on. And it's
Yeah.
not near anything that would really be contaminant. So, but for a site where where things are in question, I did find a really good site online, and I'll send it to you because I, of course, can't remember the name offhand, but it collates aerial photos um, from the ones here go back to I think 1905,
Oh,
1910, something
cool.
like that. But it'll you can look up your address and it'll show you all the aerial photos taken of the property. That could help you a little bit because you can at least see if there was ever some kind of real you know uh, industry in the area.
Yeah, that's an interesting question.
Things like that.
I know a little bit about the history of where I am, uh, and I think it was well, it actually was a very close to a Civil War fort at one point. But between that and when it became a residential area, maybe there was actually I actually have some suspicions there might have been some train related stuff. But I'm also up on a hill, so anything related to railroad would be
Mhm.
lower. Um, but yeah,
Yeah,
that's a
yeah,
really good
and
point.
you'd also
I
have
should. I don't know
yeah.
why I've not gotten soil testing before. That is a really great idea, and would be really fun to know.
Yeah,
Actually,
it's something very easy to do and inexpensive, and you may come up with some interesting information from it too. Um, but yeah, there's a lot of good programs available. I just look for one in the area, just look for a local university doing it. But that's a real good. Actually, it's another good, real general thing to recommend for people is, if you have a piece of land, no matter how small, it's kind of important to know the history of it, to know what went on there if you're going to grow anything edible, even if it's just tomatoes.
yep, that's a really great point, and I think a really great way to end this episode of Rootbound. Mallory, thank you so much for joining me on the show again.
Thank you so much. It's great to be back, and it's been great to watch your journey. So I've been enjoying it.
Thank you so much. We have heard from Mallory O'Donnell about the modern foraging uses of Hemerocallis, but this flower has been used for much longer than that. From the Rootbound Times, I'm Steve Ellington. This is the Daylily. Today, 1,500 years ago, the daylily was in common use. I speak to fake journalist Flora Bloom about her recent fake article in the Rootbound Times. Flora, thanks for joining us.
No problem, Steve. Happy to be here.
What is the ancient history of the daylily?
Well, the ancient history of the daylily is deeply rooted in East Asian culture, particularly in China, where it has been cultivated and valued for its edible and medicinal properties for centuries. Daylily, known scientifically as Hemerocallis, finds its origins in Eurasia, predominantly thriving in regions like Japan, China, and Korea. The earliest recorded mention of daylilies dates back to the Chinese Materia Medica in 656 AD, marking the plant's significant role in traditional Chinese medicine and cuisine from ancient times. This period highlights the beginning of the daylily's integration into human use, showcasing its versatility and importance across various aspects of life and wellness. Daylilies were not only valued for their beauty, but also for their nutritional and medicinal benefits. The plants were used in various forms, from fresh and dried flowers in culinary dishes to roots and leaves for treating a range of health conditions. Their application in traditional remedies includes using the plant's parts as pain relievers, diuretics, and even as treatments for specific ailments such as insomnia, jaundice, and hemorrhoids. The daylily's enduring legacy in ancient history reflects its intrinsic value to human culture. This rich historical backdrop sets the stage for the daylily's continued appreciation and use in modern times.
Flora, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Steve.
Here's what else you need to know today. You need to know that this episode of Rootbound has come to an end. Thank you for listening. My guest on this episode of Rootbound was Mallory O'Donnell. Mallory is a wild food enthusiast and cook. You can learn more about Mallory at his website, howtocookaweed.com, or on Instagram, which is Mallory L. O'Donnell. If you like Rootbound and you want to help support the show, visit rootboundpodcast.com/support to find all the ways you can help support the show, including supporting on Patreon. Rootbound is hosted by the Michael Barbaro of plant podcasts, Steve Ellington. Music by Christian Kriegesgota. Fake ads by David Lonnie. Rootbound is a podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside, but if you can go outside, find a plant you're interested in and observe it in every season.
Sponsored by the Red Hot Chili Peppers! The actual ones, not the band.